The trouble started over a gate that had been there longer than most of the HOA board members had lived in the neighborhood. It was a heavy steel gate at the edge of my property, set back from the road, clearly inside my boundary lines, and installed years before the HOA even expanded its authority map. For weeks, the HOA had been emailing me, claiming the gate blocked emergency access to a private service road they insisted everyone had the right to use. I responded with surveys, deed records, and photos. They responded with threats, fines, and finally a single sentence that made my stomach tighten. Asterisk, we will involve law enforcement if you remain non-compliant. Asterisk. I didn't expect them to actually do it. On a quiet afternoon, I heard engines slowing near the front of my property. Through the window, I saw 2 patrol cars and an SUV parked near the gate. Red and blue lights flickered, unnecessary but intimidating. An HOA representative stood nearby, arms crossed, pointing at my gate like it was contraband. The officers approached the gate, rattled it, and radioed something in. I stepped outside and shouted that they were on private property and needed a warrant. One officer told me the HOA claimed there was an emergency easement. That was a lie, and I said so, loudly. What happened next escalated fast. Without showing paperwork, one of the officers tried the latch again, harder this time. The gate groaned, metal scraping against metal. I yelled for them to stop, telling them they were damaging my property. The HOA rep waved dismissively and said, "Just open it." Instead, the officer kicked the gate near the hinge. The weld cracked with a sharp sound, and the gate swung inward, broken. Neighbors began stepping out of their homes, phones raised, recording everything. My heart was pounding, not out of anger, but fear. Armed strangers had just forced entry onto my land based on an HOA's word. I backed away, keeping my hands visible, and went inside my house. In my state, homeowners have clear rights when it comes to unlawful entry on private property. I retrieved my legally owned shotgun, kept it pointed safely downward, and returned to the doorway, never stepping toward the officers, never raising my voice. The moment they saw it, the entire atmosphere changed. Commands turned cautious. One officer raised his hands and told me to stay calm. I told them I was calm, and that they were trespassing. Somewhere behind them, I heard someone say, "Was there a warrant?" That was the moment everything cracked. The officers started asking the HOA rep direct questions. Where was the easement paperwork? Why wasn't this handled civilly? Why had they claimed an emergency? The HOA rep stammered, suddenly unsure, suddenly smaller. A supervisor was called. Bodycams were rolling. The gate hung crooked on its broken hinge, a silent piece of evidence. Neighbors kept filming. And standing there, watching the story shift in real time, I realized this wasn't just about a gate anymore. This was about abuse of power, and it was only just beginning. The supervisor arrived 10 minutes later, but it felt like an hour. By then, the energy on my property had completely changed. The officers who had first broken the gate were standing off to the side, quieter now, their earlier confidence replaced with rigid professionalism. The HOA representative, who had been so bold moments earlier, was pacing near her SUV, making frantic phone calls and avoiding eye contact with both the police and the growing group of neighbors filming from the road. The broken gate sat between us like a line that should never have been crossed. The supervisor approached me first, his tone measured and deliberate. He asked me to secure my firearm, which I did immediately, placing it back inside my home and returning with empty hands raised. I reiterated calmly that I had not threatened anyone, that the officers had forced entry onto clearly marked private property, and that the HOA had been harassing me for weeks. I handed over copies of my survey and deed, documents I'd already sent to the HOA multiple times. As the supervisor reviewed them, his expression tightened. He asked one simple question that hung in the air: why were we told there was an emergency easement? That question triggered a shift. The supervisor turned to the HOA representative and asked her to explain, on camera, what authority she believed the HOA had to order police action. She tried to repeat the same talking points: community access, safety concerns, implied rights, but the words came out disorganized and thin. When pressed for documentation, she admitted she didn't have any with her. One of the officers quietly confirmed that no warrant had been issued, no court order obtained, and no verified emergency reported. The justification for breaking my gate was evaporating in real time. As the discussion continued, neighbors began speaking up. One mentioned previous HOA threats over minor issues. Another said the HOA had tried to fine him for refusing access to his backyard. A woman across the street said she'd received a warning letter simply for asking to see HOA financial records. The supervisor listened, nodding slowly, as if he was assembling a much larger picture. This wasn't an isolated dispute, it was a pattern. The bodycams captured every word, every nervous glance from the HOA rep as the narrative unraveled. Finally, the supervisor made a call of his own. He stepped aside, spoke quietly into his radio, and then returned with a decision that changed everything. The officers were instructed to disengage immediately. No further action would be taken on behalf of the HOA. The damaged gate was photographed as evidence, and an incident report was initiated, not against me, but documenting the forced entry and property damage. The HOA representative objected, her voice sharp and panicked, but the supervisor cut her off. "This is a civil matter," he said. "And it looks like it never should have involved us." As the patrol cars pulled back, the crowd of neighbors didn't disperse. Phones stayed up. Whispers spread. The HOA rep climbed into her SUV and drove away without another word. I stood there, staring at my broken gate, knowing that this was far from over. The HOA had crossed a line, and now there was a record, official, documented, undeniable. What they thought was intimidation had just become evidence, and I could already feel the consequences starting to ripple outward. The next morning, the HOA went silent, and that silence said more than any threat email ever had. No follow-up notices, no fines posted to my account, no smug messages reminding me of community compliance. Instead, I woke up to half a dozen texts from neighbors who had been there the day before. Clips from their phones were already circulating in our private group chat. The gate breaking, the HOA representative insisting there was an emergency, the supervisor's face when the paperwork didn't exist. Someone had stitched the videos together with timestamps. Another neighbor mentioned that one of the officers had quietly confirmed the bodycam footage would be preserved because a property damage report had been filed. The story was no longer mine alone. By midday, I received an email from the HOA's management company. Not the board, not the president, but their legal liaison. The tone was a complete reversal. Where there had once been threats, there was now concern, miscommunication, and a desire to resolve this matter amicably. They claimed the police involvement was unauthorized by the board, and suggested we move forward without further escalation. Not once did the email acknowledge the broken gate or the false claim of an emergency easement. That omission told me everything. They weren't trying to fix a mistake, they were trying to contain it. I forwarded the email to a local attorney who specialized in property rights and civil liability. Within an hour, he called me back, his voice serious but unmistakably energized. He explained that the situation crossed multiple lines: unlawful entry, property damage, and potential misuse of law enforcement under false pretenses. The fact that the HOA had initiated the call and provided misleading information made their exposure significantly worse. They created a paper trail, he said. And now they're trying to rewrite it. He advised me not to respond directly and to document everything: photos, videos, emails, timestamps, witness names. Every detail mattered now. That afternoon, the HOA board scheduled an emergency meeting. Ironically, it was the first time they had ever used the word emergency correctly. Notices went out to residents, hastily worded and vague, warning against spreading misinformation and reminding everyone of their duty of confidentiality. The attempt backfired almost immediately. Screenshots of the notice were shared within minutes. Someone posted the state statute on open meetings and member rights. Another resident reminded the group that body cam footage was public record once requested. The more the board tried to tighten control, the faster it slipped through their fingers. By evening, a local reporter had reached out. She'd been tipped off anonymously and wanted to know why police had broken a homeowner's gate at the direction of an HOA. I declined to comment, for now, but the fact that the question was being asked at all felt surreal. Less than 48 hours earlier, this had been a private dispute over access. Now it was becoming a public reckoning. Standing in my driveway, looking at the temporary repair holding my gate together, I understood one thing with absolute clarity. The HOA's biggest mistake wasn't calling the police. It was assuming no one would ever push back. The HOA's emergency meeting didn't go the way they planned. Instead of a quiet, compliant audience, nearly half the neighborhood showed up, some in person, others logging in online and recording everything. The board opened with a stiff statement about maintaining community harmony, but it quickly unraveled when residents began asking direct questions. Why had the HOA claimed an emergency that didn't exist? Who authorized contacting the police? Why was private property damaged? The board members deflected at first, blaming the management company, then shifting blame to misinterpretation of governing documents. Every answer sounded rehearsed and hollow. When the floor opened for homeowner comments, the tone changed completely. One by one, residents shared their own experiences: surprise fines, threats of legal action, denied record requests, and intimidation over trivial issues. What had once felt like isolated incidents were suddenly connected. Several neighbors referenced the gate incident specifically, pointing out that the HOA's willingness to involve police over a civil dispute proved how far the board was willing to go to enforce control. The board president tried to regain authority, reminding everyone that the HOA existed to protect property values, but the phrase landed flat. No one was buying it anymore. 2 days later, the bodycam footage was officially requested and released. It showed everything the HOA had hoped would stay hidden: the false claim of an emergency, the lack of a warrant, the moment the gate was forced open, and the sudden shift in tone once documentation and witnesses appeared. The footage spread quickly through the neighborhood and then beyond it. Comments poured in from people who had never heard of our HOA but recognized the pattern instantly. The board issued a short statement calling the situation regrettable, but by then the damage was done. Behind the scenes, the pressure mounted. The HOA's insurance carrier requested a full incident report and legal assessment. The management company distanced itself, claiming it had acted on instructions from the board. 2 board members resigned within a week, citing personal reasons. The remaining members stopped responding to resident emails entirely. Meanwhile, my attorney filed formal notices demanding compensation for property damage and warning of further action related to unlawful entry and misrepresentation. For the first time since the dispute began, the HOA was reacting instead of attacking. The turning point came quietly. Late one afternoon, I received a certified letter from the HOA's legal counsel. Inside was an offer to settle, payment for the gate, a written acknowledgement of my property boundaries, and a commitment to cease all enforcement actions related to the disputed access. There was no apology, but there was something just as telling: compliance. Standing there with the letter in my hands, I felt a mix of relief and resolve. This fight had exposed more than a broken gate. It had exposed a system that relied on intimidation and silence. And now, with everything documented and in the open, the final outcome was inevitable. The settlement didn't end the story, it exposed the aftermath. Once word spread that the HOA had quietly paid for the damage and formally my property boundaries, residents started asking what else had been handled behind closed doors. Requests for financial records surged. People wanted to know how often HOA funds were used for legal threats, settlements, or emergency actions that were never disclosed. The board's earlier attempts at secrecy now worked against them. Every refusal to provide records only raised more suspicion. The culture of unquestioned authority was cracking, replaced by scrutiny and accountability. Within weeks, a special meeting was forced by resident petition. This time, the board couldn't control the agenda. An independent audit was approved by majority vote, and the management company's contract was put up for review. Former board members who had resigned were asked, publicly, why they'd left so abruptly. Some dodged the questions. Others admitted they'd been uncomfortable with how aggressively enforcement had been handled but felt powerless to stop it. Hearing that confirmed what many of us already suspected: the system rewarded compliance, not fairness. The audit results were the final shock. They revealed inconsistent fine enforcement, undocumented legal expenses, and multiple instances where the HOA had acted without proper votes or notice. Nothing criminal, yet, but enough procedural violations to put the association at risk if left uncorrected. Faced with mounting pressure, the remaining board members agreed to sweeping reforms: clearer limits on enforcement authority, mandatory legal review before involving law enforcement, and expanded homeowner access to records. It was the first time the HOA had ever publicly acknowledged overreach. As for the police department, Their internal review concluded that officers had relied on inaccurate information provided by the HOA. New guidance was issued regarding HOA-related calls, emphasizing verification of authority and property rights before taking action. The supervisor who had de-escalated the situation later reached out to confirm the gate repair had been completed and to apologize for how the incident began. That moment mattered, not as validation, but as closure. Accountability had reached every level it needed to. Standing at my repaired gate months later, the scar from the broken hinge barely visible, I realized how close this had come to ending very differently. What started as intimidation had become evidence. What was meant to silence one homeowner had unified an entire neighborhood. The HOA never admitted fault outright, but they didn't need to. Their power had been checked, their methods exposed, and their future changed. All because one gate was broken, one lie was challenged, and people finally decided to pay attention.